Hello and welcome to the History Show on Near FM. My name is Cathal Brennan, and on today's episode my co-presenter John Dorney is speaking to Dr. John M. Regan of the University of Dundee about revisionism and the Irish History Wars. If you'd like to listen to this or previous episodes of the History Show, please go to the podcast page on near.ie.
We've been talking in this decade of commemoration that's just starting about public history and how academic history affects the public's understanding and vice versa. The first question I want to ask is, this happens in other countries, these history wars. How do you see the situation in Ireland in comparison to other countries? I'm thinking particularly of Germany, for example, disputes over the Nazi regime, France over the revolution, things like that.
Yeah, there's nothing unique about the Irish experience. All societies experience conflicts over the understanding and interpretation of the historical past. And this is more pronounced where societies are at war with themselves in one way or another. Warring parties will have warring historiographies as they reach back into the past to legitimise their politics, and that describes our experience, particularly since the early 1970s, where the impact of the Northern Ireland conflict influenced the value that people placed on history, historical information, and historical interpretation.
Given that in all contested histories, people's ideology, the present day, the political demands will play a part in the formation of history, what distinction is there between disagreement and bad history?
Our understanding of the past is always conditioned by our present-day context. We cannot ignore who we are right now when we're thinking about the past or researching the past or writing history. What is bad history? Well, in a sense, I would be of the opinion that everybody's interpretation has a value and that people should be free, whether they are expert or inexpert, to develop a historical critique, to have an opinion about the past, about their personal past and the past of their society. So it's very difficult to lay down hard and set rules and say, my history is good history and your history is bad history. That said, for professional historians, certain rules exist about the interpretation of evidence, and our interpretation, where we're trying to get at some kind of historical truth, must relate to the historical evidence.
So, bad history is history that breaks these rules. So you were thinking, just before we get into the specifics, we're talking particularly about ignoring evidence, playing up evidence too much, giving one interpretation too much weight. Would that be fair?
If the discipline of history is to stand for something, then we have to have rules of engagement with the evidence. And where we do historical research, we're trying to move towards a truthful understanding of something that happened in the past. There is no absolute truth, and our interpretation will change over time as our preoccupations in present-day society change over time. We don't think about an event like the 1916 Rising now in the same way that we did in 1976, 1966 and 1956. So our historical interpretation is always in flux. But the professional historian who is pursuing historical research has an obligation to do justice to all of the evidence and to weigh and balance the various interpretations and the evidence relating to those different interpretations. And that constitutes historical research. That's what most professional academics are engaged in. And we need to be able to differentiate that from propaganda and the propagandization of the past, which is really led by a particular agenda that will very often present a one-sided view or interpretation and actually distort the historical past. So these two things sit in opposition, as I describe them now, history and propaganda writing.
In the early part of the 20th century, we had what we're now calling a revolution in Ireland. And for a long time, I think it's fair to say there wasn't an awful lot of professional or academic history done on it until the last 3 decades, I would say. These last 3 decades were also the decades when we had another conflict in Northern Ireland. The question is, what impact do you think the Northern conflict had on the understanding of the Irish Revolution in recent times?
There were reasons why there was very little written by professional historians on what you call the Irish Revolution, I call the revolutionary period. I don't agree that there was a revolution in Ireland in the decade before 1923. Mm-hmm. The historical establishment, the senior professors that controlled journals in Ireland and the profession largely, Robin Dudley Edwards at UCD and Theo Moody at Trinity, through their journal Irish Historical Studies, set prohibitions on research on near-contemporary history, and for what they believe were very good reasons. They believe that archival research or historical research should be based on the archives, on documentation. Now, today we'd say that has been a very narrow and confined interpretation of what historical research is or can be, that there are lots of different sources we can use, oral sources and so on and so forth. But in the 30s, 40s and 50s and 1960s, to a lesser extent, there was a prejudice against contemporary history. And that was largely the reason why the more modern period was not touched upon. That consensus about what history could be written and what couldn't be written began really to break down in the 1960s, when a younger generation of historians, T. Desmond Williams at UCD, FSL Lyons at the University of Kent in Britain, began for the first time really addressing seriously the what we call the revolutionary period. And that research was underway during the 1960s, and arguably what was later to be described as revisionism was well underway by the end of that decade. It was, in a sense, from a historian's point of view, from a scholarship point of view, it was just bad luck that early initiative coincided with the crisis in Northern Ireland and the breakdown of that polity into a near-revolutionary situation. Inevitably, going back to the first question that you asked, the conflict in the north raised all sorts of questions about the nature of the states in Ireland, Northern Ireland and the Republic, how they come into being, and the legitimacy of the use of political violence to effect political change. And that exerted enormous pressure on the interpretation of the past. And again, the most easy example to offer in looking at how our attitudes changed would be how the violence of Easter 1916 began to be revised by historians.
Let's get into the nitty-gritty of this. Now, the first issue is sort of chronologically backwards, but the first issue that you addressed was the Irish Civil War of 1922 to 23. And one of the kind of tropes that you've criticised is the idea that the Civil War was a battle between democracy on the Free State or pro-treaty side and militarism or authoritarianism on the anti-treaty side. And this was something that was very much influenced by the need to delegitimise the provisional IRA in the north.
I, perhaps, in some of the earlier research that I've done, may have placed a little bit too much emphasis on the influence of the Troubles, and not, although I always recognised that this revisionism that I'm talking about was underway in the 1960s. That construction of the Civil War, I would argue, was framed in the early 60s by T. Desmond Williams, Professor of Modern History here at UCD. The historian that blazes a path through an area of research is very often followed down that path by subsequent historians. Williams began to frame this, what we call the Democrats and Dictators narrative of the Civil War. The origin of that narrative, that story, that conceptualization, is in the Civil War itself. The Treatyites in 1922 claimed to represent the majority decision of the people, and sometimes they invoked the word democracy, and that was part of the Civil War propaganda. But it was Civil War propaganda. Through Williams's pen in the 1960s, in one very notable essay published in 1966 in the Irish Struggle, called From the Treaty to the Civil War, Williams began to recast that Civil War narrative away from the Republican version of it, populated or propagated by Fianna Fáil, towards this Democrats and dictators narrative that the treaty was democratically endorsed and that those that opposed it, therefore, were anti-democratic. That was already in place. What happened after 1969-1970 is that particular narrative looked increasingly attractive to a society that conceptualized the Northern conflict as a conflict between a tiny minority in the Provisional IRA and the democratic British state in Northern Ireland. Now, whether you agree with that conceptualization is a matter of interpretation and opinion, but many people would have agreed with that, and consequently the treatyite narrative, via people like Williams, began to gather momentum in terms of popular understanding, and it really begins to enter into the historiography formally in the 1980s in the work of people like Joseph M. Curran, The Birth of the Irish Free State, 1980, Ronan Fanning, Independent Ireland, 1983, and perhaps most significantly, Tom Garvin's polemic, 1922, The Birth of Irish Democracy, published in 1996.
Now, the problem with this idea, I think, of the 1922 as the birth of Irish democracy is that it ignores a whole load of complicated things that happened at the time. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, and the critical thing about the construction of narratives is that big things go ignored. Historians are very good at detail, footnotes, the minutiae of political activity, but sometimes they miss the bigger picture. So in order for the democracy story to work, one has to either ignore or deny the fact of the British threat during the course of 1922. And so what we notice in treaty-like polemics during the Civil War is that the British threat of reconquest, if the treaty is rejected or in any way abrogated by the treatyites, the anti-treatyites, if there's any slip backwards towards the Republic, the British promise that they will meet that threat with violence. But there's a lot riding on this. The treaty is a empire settlement. It's not simply a matter of Anglo-Irish relations. And the British want the treaty, and they are insistent, and they threaten war to achieve it. What we notice in treaty-ite propaganda is that argument is played down. For the anti-treatyites, for the anti-treatyite Republicans, the threat of British violence is absolutely essential because it means that there can be no free choices about the settlement. So we know, and it's well publicised, that the treaty settlement is arrived at in London under the threat of immediate and terrible war. Everybody agrees that. Everyone knows that. But that threat doesn't go away after the treaty is sent back to Dublin or once it's signed. That threat is ever constant throughout 1922. Now, the newspapers don't play it up, neither the treatyites or the British government, but it exists and everyone knows it exists. So if the treaty is rejected, there will be consequences. And so the anti-treatyite position is partly rationalised by the fact that the people are not being given an opportunity to express themselves freely in 1922, when they've done so in 1918 and in 1921 and in 1920 in local elections and at general elections. They have, for the most part, voted for a Republican settlement. Even after the violence of the IRA kicks off mid-1920, there is still measurable support for the Republican position in the face of British retaliation and so forth in Ireland. So that's the big thing that is taken out of the equation within the history books. So we can see it diminished in treaty-ite propaganda, more or less ignored in Williams' essay of 1966, but the really interesting thing occurs during the 1980s and 1990s when it is marginalised by people like Curran and people like Fanning, and by 1996 Tom Garvin denies that there was any threat of British violence in 1922. Now, this is absolutely remarkable. So here we have a big event. We have a world power, Britain and the Empire, threatening violence on the not yet independent Irish state, or the proto-Irish state, if you want to call it that. And that's significant in international diplomacy. And so the big question is, how does that slip from memory, and how does that slip out of the historiography? Because it's no small matter at all. It is fundamental. It is fundamental to understanding opposition to the treaty, the rationale of the treatyites. It's fundamental to understanding the development of the British Commonwealth in the 1920s. It's fundamental to understanding why Fianna Fáil forms in 26 and takes power in 32, and also why they dismantle the treaty during the 1930s, all because they see it as being illegitimate. It was forced upon the Irish population, and by and large, the majority of people from 1932 back that policy of what Ronan Fanning calls the quest for independence.
So it begs the question, why was it ignored then by the 1990s? And why was it possible to say that this was Democrats versus like proto-fascists?
Yes, the word proto-fascists is used. That is difficult to explain. Partly we see the emergence of a consensus about a particular story that historians are telling about the state. So in the 1970s, but more particularly after 1980-83, historians seem to be telling the same story about the origins of the state. The state was born in a democratic revolution, with an eye on the future, or on the present, I should say. Looking at the provisionals, their violence is anti-democratic. Their violence has no mandate, no majority backing. And so the story there is that the state in the Republic is created through a democratic process, therefore the violence that was used to create it was okay, whereas the Provost violence is not okay because it's anti-democratic. And that's a political argument. That has to be a political argument. Because, of course, 1916 had no mandate, and how could it? So it's a much more ambiguous argument. Where is that coming from? Well, there's a shift in the historiography, there's no doubt about it, and Williams is moving in this direction in the 1960s. But a lot of roads lead back to the kind of arguments that Conor Cruise O'Brien is developing in the 1970s, particularly as a spokesman on Northern Ireland for the Labour Party, and then later as a government minister. He is invoking this rhetoric of the democratic revolution. And that's out there. That's a political argument by a government minister. It's not a historical interpretation. But in the next decade, we begin to see this seeping back into historical writing by professional academic historians. So you have historians talking about Michael Collins, leader of the treatyites, his democratic credentials. We're seeing the term democracy attributed exclusively to the treatyites. And these are not historical rationalizations.
Just before we leave that, though, and just for the sake of balance, there is an argument that the anti-treatyites did lose an election and then they proceeded to go against the results of the election. So there is some validity to this argument.
Yes, there is some validity to this argument, and what's critical is how the election is interpreted. Is the election an endorsement of the treatyite position and a rejection of the Republican position? And the answer has to be really, just matters are more complex than that. Many people that voted for a pact, the pact general election on the 16th of June 1922, is the origin moment of the democratic state, supposedly. But the pact is not easy to interpret.
Would it be fair to say the problem with the idea that the June 1922 election is pro-treaty versus anti-treaty is that, again, it's so much more complicated than that?
Yeah, a third of the votes were registered for non-Sinn Féin candidates. There was a pact between the Sinn Féin candidates who formed the panel. By and large, that pact was honoured, and the intention of the pact was to create a coalition government after the election between anti-treatyites and pro-treatyites, and forestall the drift towards civil war with a reunited Sinn Féin cabinet. Now, whether the British would have allowed that is open to question, or whether it would have been possible is open to question. But from the election data that we have, the academic research on it, the indicators are that people voted for the pact, but a significant number of people, a third of the electorate, voted against Sinn Féin. And Sinn Féin had, to some extent, tried to frustrate a free choice in the election by imposing this pact, which anticipated a Sinn Féin government on the electorate. And the electorate rejected that. So it's complex, that's the point. Nothing breaks down in history to black and white. Good guys and bad guys, or democrats and dictators. As soon as you hear that kind of polemic language, you know you're tuning into something that isn't what the historian will recognise as historical. It's polemical, and it's likely propagandist.
So this is an argument to get people agreeing with one side or the other?
It's a simplified argument, really designed for mass consumption. People like certainties, and people would, very often the public would like a past which was absent of ambiguity and perhaps not too complex, easy to understand. But like life, like our personal relationships, the past is a very, very complicated place, and it is extraordinarily unsatisfactory to simplify it into polemics, into black and whites, into yes and no's. It just doesn't conform to that if we try and tell stories from the past in a truthful kind of way. And that's a tension between public history and academic history.
And the Civil War was always a very controversial topic in the South. But I think probably even more controversial is the second issue we're going to talk about, which is the idea of sectarianism. I would say that sectarianism is so controversial because Irish nationalism would like to think that it has not been sectarian, that it represents the Irish nation, and that suggestion that it's only Catholic, that it was anti-Protestant, it undermines the whole idea of Irish nationalism. Would you agree with that?
It certainly undermines the idea of Irish Republican nationalism.
Republicanism, I should say.
And it's now an extraordinarily contentious issue. It's one that historians should face up to. Where these issues become problematic, matters of public concern and discourse, then the historian should be in a position to apply his or her skills in looking at the evidence and coming to that balanced and reasoned judgment I spoke about a few minutes ago. That is the function of a historian, and in a sense it's part of the social function of the historian to bring a degree of sanity where sometimes there are hot-headed and polemic arguments and disputes in newspapers or between politicians or commentators or even sometimes amongst fellow historians.
Now, we've spoken a little bit before about the influence of the Northern Ireland conflict on studies of the Irish revolutionary period, and the question of sectarianism, I think, is absolutely at the centre of this, because especially in the 1990s, people were using terms in Northern Ireland about ethnic cleansing, tit for tat, pogroms, terms like that. And there was also a reawakening in this time of an interest in the aspect of the Irish War of Independence which may have been sectarian. So how did this create such controversy?
I think the simple answer to that is the work of the Canadian historian, the late Peter Hart, who published in 1998 the IRA and its enemies, Oxford University Press. And Hart, in the course of that book, put forward a thesis that a great deal of Republican violence was directed against minority groupings, people on the periphery of society, tramps, sexual deviants even, and this violence was disproportionately targeted at the Protestant minority in County Cork, which was the subject of his study. So Hart really put the sectarian issue on the map in terms of historiography, and he had a formidable evidential base for this, or so it seemed at the time, based on statistics and so on and so forth. At the centre of his argument was what he called the West Cork massacre of late April 1922, sometimes called the Bandon Valley Massacre. And in his treatment of that event, he described the killing of 12 or more Protestants in West Cork, and the reason he attributed to their murder was a sectarian motive. So that really put sectarianism in the revolutionary period on the historiographical map. And allied to that was the argument that the memory of that violence and of sectarianism had been suppressed within the local community in West Cork. And in an essay that Hart published in 1996, he took that further. He said events that could be described as ethnic cleansing had happened and he went on to name half a dozen or more counties in southern Ireland, with the inference that the kind of massacre or similar events or the religious hatred that he described in West Cork had been replicated all over southern Ireland. He used the language, it was he that introduced the language in that essay of ethnic cleansing. Elsewhere, he had talked about the IRA wishing to exterminate the Protestant community in West Cork. And the argument was compelling. The evidence appeared substantial. The argument was beautifully put across. He was a gifted writer, and it was academic research. It was, it had been a PhD thesis at Trinity College Dublin. It had been reproduced with minor changes by OUP. It had gone through the academic refereeing process. And so, the thesis that he developed had pedigree, and it had the imprimatur of some of the best historians working in the area, people like David Fitzpatrick, whose own work on Clare, published in County Clare, published in 1977, really put the marker for local studies, put the marker down for local studies of the revolutionary period.
Mm-hmm. So this is very fraught, obviously, debate, and there's lots of ins and outs, but briefly, what was wrong, or what were the flaws with Hart's thesis of a sectarian massacre, first of all, in April 1922, but more generally, that Protestants were the targets of the IRA violence in the War of Independence?
Well, the simple answer to that is the evidence on which he built his thesis. But for many years, none of us thought that there was a problem. There were hackles from outside of the academy by people that cried foul about Hart's methodology. They said there were problems with interviews that he claimed to have done. They said that his footnotes didn't add up. Inside the academy, people were dismissive of this criticism, as I was, actually, in truth. At the end of the day, all of those that were killed, as Hart described them, were Protestants in West Cork, and his interpretation seemed plausible to me. I didn't really investigate it or busy myself doing research on it. I was interested in other issues, other historiographical issues about the origins of the state. Nevertheless, the problems and the anomalies kept on mounting. One of the key issues was raised by Father Brian P. Murphy of Glenstall Abbey, a historian, who noted that Hart had selectively quoted from a document called the British Intelligence Record relating to the British intelligence performance during the War of Independence. It noted that Protestants in the South very seldom gave support to the British forces. That part of the record Peter Hart quoted. But immediately following on those sentences, the record noted that an exception to that behaviour was to be found around Bandon, exactly the area where the massacre took place. And Hart hadn't quoted those sentences. And in retrospect, that should have really kind of raised significant questions about Hart's scholarship and what he was up to. As it happened, within the particular culture of the time, people shied away from taking Hart on or criticising the new light that he shone on the area. And that's an area, it's a specific area, the reasons why people behaved that way. We might discuss that later. So there were problems, and there was very little criticism from inside of the academy. I noticed in 2010, when I was reading another document, that 3 British intelligence officers had gone missing in Macroom, about 14 or 15 miles away from Bandon, in the middle of these events, at about midday on the 26th of April 1922. The massacre proper got underway 12 hours later. And as I was reading this document, the question lit up in my mind, I wonder how Peter reconciles the disappearance of 3 intelligence officers at this crucial moment with his narrative of sectarian massacre. Because we have to remember the counter-narrative, the alternative interpretation, was that these people were not killed because they were Protestants, but because they were spies. Mm-hmm. That's the counter-argument. And so in that context, recognizing that the disappearance of 3 British intelligence officers, it takes on an importance. Now, this is truce time in April 1922, and the disappearance of 3 British military intelligence officers is a significant event in any war or truce time or conflict, and that 2 of these people were quite senior. One was a brigade intelligence officer, and the other was attached to the division at Cork. So they're quite senior people. And I rushed home and I read Peter's chapter again, taking it out on the Protestants. And he mentions the disappearance of 3 British intelligence officers. But the officers' disappearance and later murder is part of a sub-narrative. It's a subclause in a sentence. And that's the only reference to it in his chapter. So that doesn't, for a historian, that doesn't make sense. Intelligence officers going missing, important. In truce time, very important. That they're senior, important. That they're murdered, important. That this event happens in the middle of a massacre is important. That they're Protestants should be important to a narrative of sectarian massacre. But they're sent off into a different story, as it were. And so I began to follow up the footnotes, and the footnotes turned out not to be accurate or functional. They didn't refer to the correct documentation, or when one checked the documentation, it didn't add up to the interpretation. And it began to unravel. And as a consequence of that, the credibility of Hart's argument about the Bandon Valley Massacre began to be undermined. But there's a very fundamental flaw in the interpretation, and it is this, that Hart was unable to identify, with one exception, anybody that participated in the massacre. He identified one person by name, Frank Bustede, as it happens, an atheist and the son of a Protestant man, in his doctoral thesis, but Bustede disappeared from Hart's interpretation when the time came to publish the book. And the problem this presents us with is that it is impossible to attribute motive without identifying who the perpetrators were. We can say that the victims were Protestant. That is indisputable. Or those people that were killed. Some of the victims were in fact Catholic. But the motive for killing them remains unknown, why we do not or cannot identify the identity of the killers.
Mm-hmm. We'll get back to you in 1 second talking about this. Are obviously serious problems from the historian's point of view and how this could have happened. But would it be fair to say, though, that again the problem is not so much that the opposite interpretation is right, that they were killed because they were reformers, because there was never sectarianism in the IRA, because Protestants never felt vulnerable. The problem is not that all that is true, but that it's complex.
It's complex, and Sometimes it has been suggested that I've said that they were, or suggested that the people that were killed were informants, and that is not the case. As far as I'm concerned, we don't have enough information about the Bandon Valley Massacre to know why those people were killed. What I've been interested in doing is kind of exploring the methodology which underpinned the argument that they were killed because they were Protestants, and it doesn't stand up. And it goes back to this discussion at the beginning of our talk about what the research historian can say. We're interested in producing interpretation that is balanced, that does justice to all of the evidence, that avoids polemic, and that recognises information that doesn't conform to the dominant story. So the sectarian narrative here is the dominant story, and the complicating information is the discovery of the 3 intelligence officers. Now, the research historian has to do justice to that. It's an important event. He has to balance and weigh the argument and how that information reconciles with the sectarian interpretation. What another kind of historian, an ahistorical public historian writing a particular form of propaganda, wants to do is to marginalize or eliminate information that complicates the simple story that they want to tell. So the intelligence officers disappear. So the threat of British violence in 1922 disappears. And that allows for a simplified narrative to be advanced, not for historians, but for public consumption. And in each case, these things are speaking to particular political agendas. In the case of the Bandon Valley Massacre, it is historically attributing sectarianism with republicanism in a bid to undermine republicanism in the contemporary situation. In the case of the disappearance of the British threat in 1922, it is attributing anti-democratic values with republicans historically in order to undermine republicanism in the present. Now, here we confront a dilemma for the contemporary Irish historian. Those arguments may contribute to the undermining of terrorism in the present, even if they are bad history. What should the historian do? That's an individual's decision for each and every historian, how they respond to that argument, that you can mobilize historical information to have a good political purpose in your society. My argument has always been quite clear on this particular issue. I was a student in Northern Ireland at Queen's during the Troubles, up until 1994 when I went to Oxford. And I thought through this problem in the early 1990s. And for me then, and I haven't changed my mind since, that the social obligation of a historian, except in absolutely extraordinary and extreme circumstances, is to say truthful things about the past. And that society is best served by having a more truthful conception of what it has been and what it is, than by lending historical information to the purpose of propaganda. Because if we are to base decisions about our society on what we know about ourselves historically, and that's the only decision-making process that I know of, then it is better to be armed with something that approximates to what happens, or what happened. So if we're going to make decisions relating to our mixture of religious communities in Cork or Clare or Tipperary, it is better to know or to have some sense of the reality of their experience rather than projecting a dubious conceptualization of religious war, ethnic cleansing, Catholics exterminating Protestants, in effect projecting West Belfast or East Tyrone onto West Cork or East Cork for that matter, or for anywhere else in the country. And that is the argument that is taking place within the community of historians at the moment. Those historians that argue, in a sense, that their job is really to mediate the past for the needs of the present. And those historians who take my view, which is that our business is in a sense of trying to discover what had actually happened in the past as to the best of our abilities. So that describes two different outlooks. The problem with the public history, or the ahistorical public history agenda, is that the history that's prescribed for society isn't necessarily the best history for that society. It will be the history that represents the interests of whoever controls the historical community, the manufacturer of knowledge, whoever pulls the strings, in the sense, in shaping the historical record. Now, you can never get away from that problem fully and totally, but where you have a research community that's interested in a sense saying truthful things about the past, then they're in a better position when mad people come along and say crazy things about the past, that minority doesn't belong to our country, or those people deserve to be killed. Those are extreme examples, but they're not totally remote from our own experience over the last 30 years. The professional historian can, in a cool and measured way, address those issues and face them down where necessary and say, you are talking nonsense, this is crazy. We can go back to the historical record, look at the evidence, and see what that says about the past. In that way, the historical profession becomes an arbiter, a source of knowledge about our society in the past, rather than the active participant in the propagation of propaganda.
Just on the question of sectarianism in the War of Independence and the revolutionary period, though, obviously there have been problems that have been shown with Peter Hart's work, but isn't it also true that there are people who just hate the idea that there could have been sectarian republicans? I mean, not so much in academia, but out there and publishing books on it.
This question comes up often, and my way of addressing it is first to say that sectarianism was part of our society, and in its different forms still remains part of our society. It was much more pronounced, no one would deny, in places like Belfast and in the northeast part of Ulster. But as you moved away from northeast Ulster, the degree of sectarianism diminished. How sectarian was Ireland in 1920? Well, I think we have to look at studies in the 19th century, and again, outside of northeast Ulster, the evidence tends to point towards not excessive sectarian hatred or intercommunal problems or violence outside of Ulster. Yes, there were tensions there. What we need, basis judgment or her judgment on, is the evidence. So for example, by 1993, when Hart was publishing his essay on the IRA in Cork in one of the edited county volume on the history of County Cork, he was not able to adduce any evidence of sectarian hatred underpinning the violence that was directed against Protestants. No evidence that could stand up. Yes, there was evidence that some Republicans talked about persecuting Unionists and Loyalists, and he was able to refer to that to back up his interpretations. But Unionists and Loyalists are not terms exclusive to Protestants in 1920, 21, 22 Cork. Any Catholic member of the RUC or the British Army could be described as a Loyalist or a Unionist, and there were many thousands of those. So, as far as I can see, Hart produced little or no evidence of sectarian hatred that could be used to justify his description of the IRA exterminating the Protestant minority there, or using the language of ethnic cleansing. That's how matters stand for me. If people can show me evidence of the kind of intensity of religious hatred that Hart assumed was there, then I'm more than willing to change my mind. But in what I've written on the Bandon Valley Massacre, I note that happening at the same time as the murders of the Protestant population there was no desecration of churches. There was no anti-Protestant rhetoric reported. There was no graffiti on the walls, no evidence of church burnings, desecrations, any of the ancillary evidence we would expect to find with the murder of Protestants because of their religion in what was an exceptional incident. Now that doesn't prove anything per se, but it is simply to highlight the lack of evidence that Hart was able to bring to the table in support of his interpretation.
Would you agree with me then that the key is that people can in the future disagree over conclusions, but they must base it on clearly cited evidence? Is that the key here?
For me, history should be rooted in an interpretation of the evidence. That is our business as historians. We have rules of engagement with the evidence that we look at. It's different for different areas of history. But where there is a body of archival material, we should be able to examine the evidence that other historians use. We should be able to check what they're basing their interpretation on. These are all parts of processes that describe what it is to be a professional historian. Hart, of course, used anonymous interviews and never made the transcripts available. And that was one of the problems that emerged in the debates around his work. But yes, we have to go back to the evidence. That is our business. And part of our business is to debate and discuss with one another different interpretations in order to see which interpretation is best or has strong elements of argument within it. Sadly, what has happened around this debate is that as soon as the orthodoxy was challenged, people were denounced as Republican fellow travellers, conspiracy theorists. The insinuation that they were terrorist supporters was wheeled out almost immediately. And this on the foot of people that, like myself, were producing in seminars and elsewhere the fruit of refereed research, that is to say, research that had published or was about to be published in historical journals, that had been tested by fellow historians anonymously, gone through the editing process, with serious historical research based on evidence, and yet certain people within the academy denounced that as being a conspiracy theory about Hart or about the academy more generally. And that has been singularly the most disappointing aspect of the debate so far. One is looking for engagement in order to advance historical knowledge and understanding, in order to serve society in the way that I've described earlier on in this conversation. And that hasn't always happened.
Okay, John Regan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was John Dorney talking to Dr. John M. Regan of the University of Dundee. My name is Cathal Brennan, and you have been listening to The History Show on Near FM.